I stopped writing this movie about 20 times because I thought it was impossible. I thought it wasn't going to work. I thought no one would ever make this movie. But I kept coming back to it because I knew if someone let me make this movie, that people would hear it and people would see it.
I allowed it to be my hobby. I allowed it to be the project that I would go to instead of watching television. That would be the most fun thing I could do with my time.
It started with dreams and ideas and things that were bubbling up from my subconscious. And then at some point, figuring out, going on this mission to figure out what I was trying to tell myself.
If you can predict where an audience is going to go or what they think you're going to do, you can use that momentum against them. You know, I sat down and I would smoke a little bit of weed and try and write a mind-bending horror film, my favorite genre. And at some point, I just followed the truth.
If you're telling a story and you're not bearing part of your soul or telling your truth, I think that you're not doing that right.
That's, in so many ways, this movie is all of you, all the parts of you. Being biracial, being in show business and getting two different messages. Like the best genre stuff, this is an incredibly autobiographical movie in a lot of ways, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think the only way to, I will ever attempt to create anything again is to be vulnerable with my own emotions. And it has to, in some way, it has to be autobiographical. If you're telling a story and you're not bearing part of your soul or telling your truth, I think that you're not doing that right as well. Certainly that's the case for me. And I think when I invented that party sequence, that was a huge moment for me of saying, you know what, these fears, justified or not justified, however they come, these fears of mine, I've never seen them portrayed in film, and the whole process of figuring out what this movie was about digging deep and exploring my fears first, and trusting that if I got that across, that we're all human, we're all made up of the same emotions, and that and this is what you sort of find in comedy as well, is if you put your truth out there, however specific it feels, however much you feel like this is just me, no one else is going to relate to this, no one's going to care, that's not the case. People are drawn to truth like magnets in art, I think. And you can see that. I mean, it's really easy to see in comedy, because when something feels true and when something rings true, you get a laugh, and if it doesn't, you don't. And it's just that simple.
I was trying to bring a piece of the conversation I'd never seen put on film before. I felt like there was this void in the way we talk about race, especially at the time when I wrote it, which was actually a very similar time to when we wrote the Obama Luther Translator sketch. We felt like racism was not being called out sufficiently enough for us.
And you said you're trying to tell your own truth? What is that?
Well, really my truth as a black man, that my perspective that I haven't seen in film before. I haven't seen that represented.
Like?
So like in the party scene in Get Out, for example, it's a scene where it's a group, he's the only black guy, It's a bunch of older white people who are trying to connect with him on his blackness first, and saying things like, you know, I know Tiger, I know Tiger, right? And that's a situation that, you know, I've been in. I think every minority has been in. I imagine you know, if you're a woman in a room full of men, you're viewed as a woman before you're viewed as a human being, and it's those little. It's, you know, on the surface, it's a harmless thing, but what I wanted to point out with this film is that it's connected to the deep horror of racism.
You know, comedy is where I'm from, and the process of doing sketch comedy, you know, week after week on Key and Peele, very much became about this idea of jujitsu, of judo. If you can predict what and where an audience is going to go or what they think you're going to do, you can use that momentum against them. So that, you know, all over this movie, I knew I wanted to have reveals. I knew I wanted to have twists, but most importantly, you know, I figured if an audience thinks they know what's going on, and whether they like it or they don't, if you can show them that they've been watching something completely different the entire time, I think they have the respect. And there's a real intellectual catharsis that comes with that, and it's fulfilling for an audience. So, you know, there was a while, I mean, the real big one in this, there's a few big ones. There's the Rose reveal, which, you know, it was a very difficult thing to hide that Rose was evil. Because, you know, it's like, you look at on paper, she's bringing him there. To expect an audience not to think that is almost impossible. So I had to kind of direct her and write that, you know, as if it was a different movie, as if it was this love story, and to, you know, try and convince the audience to just root for the two of them to escape together, or to think at its worst something is going to happen to one of them and the other one. That was one of the most fun reveals to protect.
In the writing of this, how do you separate the crafting the narrative and building the drama versus the integration of all these ideas, making social commentary that you're talking about? How many drafts does that take?
A lot of drafts.
Hell, you like started this 5 years ago, you said, right?
Well, no, I started it longer. I started in 2008, 2009. I developed the story for 5 years before I put pen to paper and wrote the script. So for 5 years, this was a project that I felt like was ambitious enough that there was a good chance it would never get made. And I thought ambitious in the subject matter. The idea of doing a thriller that explores the victimization of black people.
By starting with a scene that basically is the scene we're used to seeing, where the black guy disappears, he's never heard from the rest of the movie. I mean, that alone is like a great idea.
So, well, and a terrifying idea to write, because again, I thought, no, this isn't going to pass the smell test for anyone. You know, every white person in this movie is evil. You know, you can't make that movie. You can't make a movie where a black man kills a white family at the end in cold blood and the audience is rooting for him. Like, that movie doesn't get made. So I had internalized this idea and said, look, I can't worry about this movie getting made. I have to write my favorite movie that doesn't exist. And so that put me on this path of working on this, and it wasn't like I was every night, I was like, no, for 5 years. It was, I allowed it to be my hobby. I allowed it to be the project that I would go to instead of watching television. That would be the most fun thing I could do with my time. And the whole purpose of it was to help me get better as a writer, because I know that from Key and Peele, when you're having fun writing, that's when you get like the East-West Bowl shit, you know, where it's just, it works. Fun works. And that's kind of my advice to anybody
any writer or artist dealing with writer's block, which we all deal with, and follow the fun. Follow, if you're not having fun writing, you're doing it wrong. Shift up your tactic.
Well, so, the question is a great question. How much does Hollywood, the studio, the producers sort of interfere with my vision? Now, I can speak from my personal experience, which is, I made a cheap movie. I made a movie for $4.5 million. Part of the reason that was a good fit for my first movie was because, that's very little money in the film industry. So because of that, I knew I had the leverage to push boundaries, to push buttons, to stand by my, what the film was meant to be for me. When there were debates and when there were differing opinions of how something should go, my strategy was not to pop off.
The hard part.
I listened. I feel like every note that somebody can give you has something of worth in it, has something of value. So if somebody tells me, hey, you shouldn't have this happen in the movie because it's too violent. Well, I'm thinking, well, it's supposed to be violent. What I don't do is go in and change my movie and take out the violence. What I do is ask myself, okay, I hear that. So how can I put in something earlier that makes that violence feel better? How can I bring this person into the perspective of the person who's committing the violence enough that I will never get that note again from anybody? So I think it's important to be respectful of people's opinions, even if they're wrong. There's some reason they're having that reaction, and then to engage in dialogue with them, and stand up for what the film needs to be.
For me, these movies like The Stepford Wives, Rosemary's Baby, movies from the 60s, 70s, they had this pace and it's intelligence to them.
Yeah.
Where you're headed towards this crazy twist,
right?
But you don't know what it is, and then when you get there, it becomes obvious. You've been watching it the whole time.
Right.
I love those movies. I love the mind game of those movies, and I think audiences like that.
I think they do too. I think people want to think, and I think you gave us a chance to do that and figure it out as it goes along.
Oh well, thank you. Hey, the way I feel is like if you start with how it feels, and like I said, you put Lakeith in this scene, you can be transformative. Like you can make a movie where Black people recognize and feel that feeling that we feel on a day-to-day basis, and white people can come in and be like, oh,
that was offensive.
I'm feeling that too.
Like that, it made me uncomfortable.
It made me uncomfortable.
I get it.
So to me, that's like that's why a good movie, a good story can do more for social change in a lot of cases.
And I think we need it right now more than ever.
But I'd like to know, what is your writing ritual or routine?
Great question, and thank you for that. I'll talk about the way this movie was written, because it's the process I'm going to try and replicate as best I can. But as I was starting to say, it started with dreams and ideas and things that were bubbling up from my subconscious, and then at some point figuring out, going on this mission to figure out what I was trying to tell myself. This one was one that I started very early, really as looking at it as a producer as well, and saying, okay, well, this is, obviously if this movie gets made, it's not going to be a huge budget, and so let's mine the things that work that don't require a huge budget. That is, so that's why I put a lot of the horror and the scares in the dialogue, in the performances, in the moments, in the ideas, because I knew I wasn't going to be able to do any sort of sweeping, huge monsters or any kind of thing like that. So it was all very, this combination of strategy and gut inspiration. And you need both. And it took a long time because it was, weaving these things together.
How is doing scary movies similar to doing comedy?
Great question. I mean, they're both, for me, they're both about truth. If you're not accessing something that feels true, you're not doing it right. And they also, the technique of them, you have to be very tuned into the audience and their emotion. And that's why with both forms, the technique is tension building and release.
When we're a teenager and all that, and we feel the most isolated. I felt, I had friends, but still felt kind of like an alien or like someone who was misunderstood. The more and more I'd be drawn to stories that explore the power of the other side, the dark side. When I started writing Get Out, I was in a state of great fear, low in my life, and these projects have dug me out of that darkness.
And so when you're standing up the back of a cinema and you watch an audience watching Get Out or watching us, and you see them leap with fear, is that a little moment where you feel like God for that one brief second?
I can tell, I've done, comedy for, over 15 years and gotten some great laughs. Nothing really compares to the feeling of getting the audience to shudder again. There's a mischievous pleasure. You will see me in the theater laugh if I get the audience on that level.
There's a lot of therapy that goes into this moment.
There's a lot, yeah, and I don't know, something about it is that I have less of an exact science for wielding fear, as I call it. It's more of an alchemy than comedy, which became almost mathematic at a certain point. Nothing beats hearing the audience be afraid and then giggle afterward.
Cut. I think this means so much because writers know how fucking hard it is to write something. This was a passion project. It was something that I put my love into, I put my soul into. So getting this from you means so much. I started writing it in 2008, and there was a lot of ups and downs. I had to tell people, people ask, what are you writing? What are you working on? I'd be like, I'm writing this thing about a black dude that goes to his white girlfriend's house, and the parents perform brain surgery on him and try and swap heads. I'd give it away instantly. And people would just look at me like, okay, you're losing your mind. I just want to say thank you, and everyone in this room that is a writer, keep taking chances, take big risks, put your love into it. It does pay off, and it's the hardest thing, and it can take a long time, but our voices really do matter. Thank you very much.